Good afternoon. My name is Jim Eskin. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Eskin Fundraising Training's 82nd webinar. And we have a good friend that actually, I think, has set the record for most appearances. She's making her third appearance, and we're going to introduce her in a moment. But first of all, a couple of things. I'd like the audience to take a moment. Barbara, we have the entire nonprofit family. We have professional leaders, executive directors, directors of development. We have board members, we have donors, we have volunteers. So if everybody could just take a moment and type in the chat space your name, the name of your nonprofit, and your location. And make sure if you're part of the Houston Rotary Club, make sure that's clear, because if we had a prize, we would give a prize to you. And I'd like to introduce my producer, John Largent, who's with the CEO of Game Day Media. John, there are two ways. I have about 25 questions prepared for our special guest, but this show belongs to the audience. So if anytime you have a question about my questions or about her answers, John, tell them how they can either go in the chat space or raise their hand, and we'll give them audio and video privileges.
Yeah, that's right. And we've also added the Q&A feature down at the bottom of the screen. So if you want to actually ask a question, you can go into the Q&A section, ask your question, and I will get that to Jim, or if he wants me to read it aloud, I will read it aloud so that you can interact that way. But we're going to have Jim and Barbara on screen for the majority of the show. And I think toward the end of the show, if you have questions and want to come on the screen, we can make you a panelist and pull you in.
Barbara, do you know David Weishman? I believe he's in Houston Rotary. David, are you in Houston Rotary? Okay. We'll give you credit for being. First of all, it's a pleasure to introduce our guest for the third time. Barbara Radnofsky combines intelligence and kindness. I don't know which stands out more, but I wish there were more Barbara Radnofskys in the world. I have a 10-page CV, and I got a permission to distill it into 2 sentences. Through a remarkable career, Barbara is an author, a teacher, a lawyer, a mediator, and a civic leader. She's devoted her life's work to problem solving and to developing more productive relationships, which result in improved outcomes. Also, not to be overlooked, she is a grandmother, and if I have this right, Barbara, you're grandmother of 5, and if I know the ages are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, sounds like you're doing some good planning there. And so I'll put you on the spot. What's your favorite age for a grandchild?
Oh, I would say 6, and we'll see.
There's a little politician in her. That's a great answer. John, can you put the book cover on the screen? Barbara is just authored her second book. It's called Listening Space, a Barbershop Guide to Problem Solving. And Barbara, by the way, you made one of my bucket list items come true. On the back page are a couple of blurbs, and my bucket list dream is always to be on the same page as a Kennedy family member. And one of her blurbs is from former U.S. Congressman Joe Kennedy. So let's start with this book. First of all, how's the Radnofsky family doing?
Oh, everybody's great. Thank you very much, especially in these different kind of times. Everybody's
and I hear you're doing a lot of grandmother duty.
I get to babysit every night. Thank you. I get to.
Okay, let me ask you. I didn't ask you this before. What do they call you?
I'm Nana.
Nana. Okay. Okay, let's start. Congratulations on your new book, Listening Space, a Barbershop's Guide to Problem Solving. Can you tell us about the contents and more specifically, how nonprofit leaders can use the contents of the book to minimize skirmishes and disagreements in their organizations and improve the quality of decision making?
Well, that's a big task. I'll try to do it efficiently.
You have time.
It's a how-to book, really, with a good appendix at the end with the forms for teachers or for anybody who wants to learn how to put on a mediation. But as far as the how-to, it sets it out and gives little examples and some big examples of how to set up a process. If you think of one thing that comes out of my answer on this, it would be you need to develop a process for problem solving, and you need to provide a protected space where people can feel safe and respected. And the way it's done and the way I teach it to children and to adults, and in my practice as a mediator, as a lawyer, you use the process of an introduction where you set out ground rules and you get agreement to ground rules. And they're pretty basic. But the basics are you show respect, you listen without interrupting, and you agree to abide by the rules that are going to be enforced not just by the mediators. And in the case of children, we always use two mediators in tandem, helping each other. But with adults, we usually use one mediator. And everybody will help enforce the ground rules. So if someone interrupts or someone is misbehaving or shows disrespect, everyone enforces the ground rules and says, you agreed at the outset. Then the bulk of the mediation is involved in two stages. And the first stage is where you identify what the problems are. And sometimes the problems are not what people have identified coming.
It must be must be difficult to solve a problem if the parties can't agree on what the problem is.
Right. And so the first part is you identify the problem. And the way you do it is by listening. And the hardest part of the book, I think, and the hardest part for me always has been listen.
Yeah.
And you listen as if it matters. It's called active listening. I'm sure many of the folks listening to this understand the concept, but it means not listening to try to argue or listening to just try to be patient. It's listening to gain information and gain understanding. Yeah. And so we have techniques we use to teach children and adults how to listen. One of them, for example, is you remember the acronym WAIT, WAIT, and kids are great at this. WAIT, wait, stands for why am I talking? And so you ask yourself each time you want to open your mouth, wait, why am I talking? Children really love the acronym.
Why the choice of Barbershop, by the way? Why is this a Barbershop guide?
Well, the reason it's a Barbershop guide is this kind of information is pretty darn boring. And going through these processes, which involve active listening and then brainstorming solutions, and then using critical thinking to test solutions, all those concepts that have to be learned, they're boring. But what is fun is illustrating the concepts with stories. So I have my publisher to thank from my first book, who reviewed it and recognized it as a how-to book and realized it needed to have something fun and not be boring. And so one of my children, and children are your best critics, suggested, start telling stories, which is really one of the best ways to communicate to people. So who better than the most famous barber I know in the NASA area? My barber, since I was a child, my husband's barber, our parents' barbers, because both our parents worked for NASA. And Carlos Villagomez is the most extraordinary barber and one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. A 50-plus year barber who still works in the NASA area and was the barber to the astronauts and tells stories and problem solves better than anybody. A Navy veteran from a childhood of 15 kids growing up in the segregated wards of the ship channel. He was a Navy hero, and the stories of his naval exploits are amazing. And it is one reason why so many of the astronauts grew to be loving friends of Carlos, because so many of them were naval aviators, and they understood that this is a guy who saw action, did his duty, came back, and still was, or even better, a great problem solver. So the book has many stories of how the astronauts.
And by the way, he's a barber, not a hairstylist. Is that right?
Oh, that's right. This is a little tiny barbershop. It's a shotgun shack. Still.
How many seats in it?
Well, there's 2 seats, of course. It's a shotgun shack. There's no room for anything else. And it's next to his other business that he formed. despite the local riffraff not liking the idea of a barber named Villa Gomez opening up a beer garden in their area. But the locals liked it. The cops at the time did not, and they made Carlos one of the civil rights pioneers, not on purpose, but a pioneer. And because of the renegade cops who shot up his business and his determination to still stay and be peaceful, and he peacefully resolved all the disputes that arose out of being shotgunned, he became mayor pro tem after becoming city councilman of the little town, and brought it to the thriving place that it is, was a 40-year member of Rotary, and did wonderful things, not just for the community, but for the international work that Rotary does. And he's a beloved member of the community still, crossing all political lines, crossing all social lines, is a great philanthropist. And so the book has its endings after talking about his friendships and how he solved problems, including borrowing my guide, because I'm a guide. And he said, give me that children's guide. I've been asked to solve a dispute with local businessmen. And he practiced it brilliantly when he solved the businessman's problems with the little children's guide.
Barbara, you already touched my second question. I mean, it's human nature that we like to talk, not listen. We like to talk. So what's it take to learn how to really listen, not just to fake listen, but to listen, to increase understanding? And how about, can you enjoy listening? Because I think it seems everyone rather talk than listen.
Great question. And I think it involves a willingness to learn. And the way I think you can help people understand why it's in their best own interest. If they're not feeling particularly generous to others, and everybody's trying to preserve their own interests, that's the nature of self-preservation. But if it can be shown that when you listen, you gain more information. Mm-hmm. And there are many studies out there. The book talks a little bit about the virtues of listening, not just to be a good person and to make other people feel better, but because it's the way you get what you want. Mm-hmm. The way you
Hey, can you repeat that?
You get what you want by listening, not by talking.
I think we have to put that on a bumper sticker.
All right, there you go. It's a long bumper sticker, Sugar.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, I couldn't resist this question.
Okay.
So much of us are influenced by the movie The Right Stuff.
Yes.
But based on your research about the astronauts, do you have a favorite story or two you'd like to share?
There are many. The longest story in the book goes through the entire book, and it shows how Carlos and Alan Shepard became lifelong friends, not just barber and client.
Let's remind people, Alan Shepard was the first American to go into space.
Yes, he was the first American to go in space, and before that, he was an accomplished Navy pilot in World War II, but more spectacularly after World War II, he saw very active service. He was one of the first to fly off naval carriers and land safely. He was a pilot's pilot, and he loved golf, and he had a desire because he was going to become, he knew, and became probably the most famous face on the earth at the time. And he was very careful about his appearance. And this was, as it became later in the 60s, and he came to Carlos, he wanted to change from his flat top and haircut. He wanted to get into a shag, but nothing that looked unprofessional. So Carlos created what's called the businessman's haircut for him. And before the takeoff of Apollo 14, Alan Shepard spoke to the press about his haircut and his hair styling. As a result, Carlos went international, and the publicity on purpose that Alan Shepard got for Carlos meant he had to move out of the Holiday Inn hotel room he was renting and get slightly larger space. And eventually it led to him being able to open up his own Barbershop, buy land, buy his little shotgun shack, and
Yeah.
then buy the beer garden. And Alan Shepard went into the beer distribution business.
Huh.
And Carlos ended up showing Alan the ropes on how do you talk to guys in bars? Because Alan Shepard was not an expert on talking to regular guys in bars. And the two of them had many adventures together, many of which I cannot write about. But the ones are my favorite stories. It's how Carlos, for example, ended up advising Adolf Coors, who the astronaut was a Coors distributor. And so he shows up to explain what you need to do in terms of rotating cans and not disturbing the patrons or the people behind the bar, and why it's so important, especially when there's private bars where there are certain activities going on where nobody wants to be disturbed. I'll leave it at that. But he also ended up advising Adolf Coors on how the lady bartenders, because Carlos used very pretty lady bartenders, and they were always getting their hands cut by opening up the cans. And it was Carlos who came up with the idea of use tabs on cans so these women are not getting their fingers cut. And so Adolf Coors twice adopted Carlos's techniques for improving beer cans. There's many other adventures. There's a mediation by George Bush in the White House for one of America's storied astronauts who wanted to go back into space. And the astronaut's beautiful wife, who always had great ideas, thought her way through how to get a visit to the White House. And then they ended up through her grace, just a wonderful woman. The commander's wife then was invited back for a state dinner. And during the state dinner, George Bush mediated a dispute that put the astronaut back into space. And there's just wonderful side stories, all from the astronaut.
By the way, doesn't Carlos have a very special golf ball?
Yes, the book ends with the gift after Carlos had asked, when he was doing Alan Shepard's hair, cutting extremely short before he went up in Apollo 14. First, you have to go into weeks of quarantine. It was special for Apollo 14. They didn't want any moon dust. They weren't sure what would happen. And so he had quarantine before, so he didn't get sick. And he had quarantine after expected. So if they brought back any moon bugs, they wouldn't be a problem. So it was going to be a long period of time. Shepard knew he'd be facing the press. And so he said, cut it real short. And he made an appointment to say, I will be back before I see the public. Well, when astronaut Shepard got out of quarantine and showed up very quietly with his wife at Carlos's door at the hotel room where he was still cutting hair next door to NASA, they locked the door, got him under the hair dryer after he cut it and got it permed, and he left. But before he left, and when he came to shake hands, he was still in his flight suit, all messy, and he was still in his flight suit. He shook hands with Carlos, and Carlos felt an orb in his hand. And it was a signed golf ball by Alan Shepard, who's told him, take very good care of this.
Wow.
And as you know, Shepard was very famous for having hit 2 golf balls in space. And so the book and a new documentary that's coming out is going to question whether or not this is an actual flown ball, or is it one of the balls that Alan Shepard gave to a few special people? He would sign them because he was known for golfing on the moon. So the documentary doesn't really answer the question, but there certainly is some argument to be made. So that's that particular gift from Alan Shepard.
That's a great story.
Are on the walls of his barbershop. Many of the gifts.
Why do you think emotions run so high in nonprofits? I've been at meetings and they were so animated, they almost turn into physical fights.
Well, I think it's in part because people of good faith care very deeply, and they do not have a process. I'm getting back to process again.
You like that word, don't you?
It is so important. It has taken me, I've been practicing law more than 40 years. It's taken me a long time to respect the process of mediation to the degree I do. We lawyers learn about due process, and the book talks about this. In our Constitution, due process means both notice of the problem that you're being charged with, or that the problem you've got. You have to have notice, but you also have to have a fair opportunity to be heard. That's constitutional due process. And so in the context of mediation, people care about the process, even though they may not have the right legal words for it. They want to be listened to. And the notion of you sitting and listening, and the book cites some studies that show you can be more effective if you spend more percentage of your time listening than you do speaking. And it's not full of endnotes like that first book that has hundreds of endnotes, but this one does have a few. And I would tell people, take a look at the psychology endnotes and some of the other information available. It's a process that needs to be discussed.
We're going to really talk about this process in live applications. One is, there's a board, let's call the two board members Mo and Larry, okay? And every meeting they go at each other, and other board members are tired of it. It's become personal. What can you do if you have two board members that are constantly bickering during the board meeting, in which really takes some of the potential out of the board to do its mission?
It happens a lot, and I think you're probably aware of it. And
I've seen it.
The solution, I think, lies in treating each one of them with the respect that's due, and making time, set aside time and a different place and a different space to find out what's really going on. And that usually needs to happen with a neutral, someone who is not on either side. So you have to pick someone who is effective at being neutral. And really, the book is aimed at just the scenario you're talking about in the real world, where people have conflicts or institutions have conflicts. And by setting up a process, and the book, it may seem simplistic to some people because it's based on how we teach children, but it works. Carlos used it with two businessmen. They came together. They agreed to be listeners first. They agreed to take turns and not interrupt. They agreed to a process whereby after they got through the beginnings, they brainstormed solutions to the problem that they had. Turned out, by the way, the problem had nothing to do with what they'd been talking about.
Oh, shit.
It turned out the problem was of an entirely different nature. And only until they listened to each other could they identify what the problem was. And only then could they brainstorm the solutions. Then they finally got to use critical thinking to select which solution would actually work, because they came up with some, people do come up with crazy solutions, and you have to listen to it. And you can't just quash it. You have to listen to it and write it down. And the book talks about how to be a good scribe. Write down what the suggestions are during brainstorming. And then in the final stage, where you use critical thinking, the way scientists do, the way my father was raised to be a critical thinker. My father was a NASA worker. And so it can be done, but you need to observe a process because they feel respected. They may not get what they want, but they may get the respect. And maybe it was the respect that these two warring board members who care about
let's take another example. I'm going to pick on Mo and Larry again.
Okay.
Mo and Larry, every board meeting, they're always negative. It doesn't mean they're fighting with each other, but they're always negative. And so my question to you is, if you have board members who are always negative, should you ask them to leave the board? And if you ask them to leave the board, what should be the process?
I'll have to say at the outset that one depends. There are many factors. And I think before you ask the negative people to leave the board, you're going to need to have a sit down to find out, why are they negative? And if it may not be anything related to the institution. And just by listening to them, you won't necessarily solve their problem, but by listening to them and they feel heard, they may feel that they have a better understanding of what's at stake. So I think you need to separate these people from the environment of a board meeting. It can't happen. You cannot mediate during a board meeting. You're going to have to give them extra time. And that means bringing in somebody, again, it sounds like the same answer as before. You have to have somebody who is neutral and willing to learn how to be neutral, not passive. A neutral isn't always.
What's the difference between passive and neutral?
Neutral means you literally aren't going to take sides. You're not there to be the judge. Passive is somebody who just doesn't get involved. But mediators do get involved. The neutral does get involved. You enforce the ground rules. You go back and forth if they're separated in different rooms. You carry the message in an effective way. And you also guide them as a neutral. When they start brainstorming, you be the scribe. They don't, when you're mad or you're arguing or you're doing something, you cannot be the scribe of all these great ideas or bad ideas going on. And so the neutral can do a lot to being the scribe. And then you announce, okay, we've got the list of ideas. Now we are transitioning. We are in now a different stage. Now we're going to use critical thinking. We're not brainstorming anymore. We're critical thinking. We've moved on. Don't backslide into arguing. We're now going to talk about how will it work? What are the advantages and disadvantages? And then we're going to select the best solution.
Another problem I'm sure a lot of our learning communities members can relate to. What do you do about a board member that does not respect board staff boundaries and they begin to micromanage the organization?
The answer is to find out why.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if this is a valuable board member, and what's more valuable than a good board member, right? So if it's a valuable board member, you want to find out what's wrong. And you also must protect your staff. There's just, they're also incredibly valuable. And so the process, by the way, doesn't have to be face-to-face. Sometimes staff are intimidated by very powerful board members. And so it can be done in separate rooms. It can be done by Zoom. It can be done so many different ways. You can be as innovative as you want. And what the mediator does is, like old-fashioned Henry Kissinger shuttle diplomacy, you literally shuttle back and forth, and the mediator becomes the voice of the other person and the advocate for the other person. And it's understood that the mediator is being neutral, but is conveying the argument or the position as effectively as they can. And then the mediator literally can be the go-between so that you don't have to have what may be an unfair relationship. Now, of course, if there are criminal misconduct, if we're talking about intimidation or worse, sometimes for some people, intimidation is about as bad as it could be. But if you're talking about something that's potentially criminal, you really can't mediate that. Yeah. At that point, you can't take the law into your own hands. If there's been misconduct at the level that is potentially abusive, criminal, involving weapons, things like that, regular people, normal people, you can't mediate that.
Barbara, I have a lot more questions, but John, do we have any questions yet from the audience?
We have one comment from Margie. Okay. Excuse me. No, it's from Megan. And it's
Megan Doyle, right? Welcome to the show, Megan. Megan, you're looking, Barbara's the one that's connected me. Megan, you're in Providence, Rhode Island. Where are you now?
Well, her question is on this line of thought. Do you find resistance in starting mediations? If so, how do you engage or start the mediation with individuals that are resistant to engaging in mediation? Does the initial brainstorm start individually before coming together? How do you encourage people to come to the table? And she says she just moved back to Houston.
Well, welcome back.
Welcome back to Houston. Welcome to Houston. First things first, to get people to agree to mediation is a big deal. And then we'll talk about preparation. To get people to agree to mediation, now in the court system, of course, they're compelled to do it. They're already in litigation, and some judges order them to mediation. Most of the cases I do are not court ordered. Most of the cases I do are voluntary. Maybe the reason there's resistance is it's expensive. And so what you need to do is ask, if it's especially for a nonprofit, ask the mediator to do it for free as a pro bono action. Most lawyer mediators will do a portion of their practice for free. And I have to say, as a lawyer, that it's very difficult to mediate when people aren't represented. If they have a legal claim, as opposed to the kind of disputes, Jim, you're talking about, if they have a legal claim, it's really impossible to do it effectively without a lawyer, especially if one side is represented, the other is not. But when they're both not represented, it's very difficult. So the usual effective way is to get a lawyer. If, however, it's one of the disputes, for example, that Carlos mediated as a non-lawyer with no legal issues involved, and their personality conflicts, the way to do it is to find somebody who is genuinely neutral, who is respected. And it is the respected person who can go to both and assure them it's the neutrality that they want. They want fairness. They want to be listened to. Sure, everybody wants somebody to have it decided in their favor. But deep down, they know that if they could just get a neutral who would be fair, that's what's key. And so that is the key. Tell them they'll be treated fairly. Now, about preparation. Preparation is essential. And perhaps the biggest part of the book is about preparation, because there's so many levels you can prepare. And that's what the children love to do, teaching the children how to get ready for
in your base, here's an off the record question. Who's it easier to mediate, children or adults?
Children are better mediators and participants than adults. Children with empathy are the best of all. And my favorite group to teach are children with various special needs, because you will not find a more empathetic, more willing to learn. And there is a kindness and a gentleness to children, and particularly to children who have not had fair treatment their whole life, and who have experienced discrimination, who know what it's like. And to a person, I have found them to be more empathetic, more kind, and their experiences have made them empaths. And what they need to do, and the discipline that's required to be a mediator and not be a judge, which is so hard for all of us. It's so hard not to take sides. And so it's the key for them is to learn your effectiveness, and the way you can help people is by not being the judge, by not taking sides. And once they get it, and they love to play act, much of the learning process for mediation is play act. And children are better at play acting than adults. But once the adults get into it, if you're teaching a group of adults, especially like a board, once they get into play acting, they love it, because it's not themselves, and they could pretend to be the character that we ask them to take as they're trying to resolve a difficulty. That's really what the appendix is about, play acting.
Did I see that Greg Munster have a question? He raised his hand. Okay, Greg, let us know if you have a question. Barbara, the next one, again, is a place I think we've all been. You have an issue X, and there is a heated argument, probably your board meeting's an hour and a half. Well, you get stuck on talking issue X maybe for 45 minutes. What's the good way you can delegate a resolution of that particular issue with a committee or a task force?
I don't mean to be too straightforward, but you got somebody running the show, right? You've got a presiding officer, and so
a chairman.
Okay, whoever the chairman or acting for the chairman is, and maybe the ED it depends on, I guess, the nature of the relationships. But somebody could suggest, let's table this discussion right now, and let's go into some sort of protected group meeting where it will be confidential. And the mediation confidentiality depends. If it's a legal mediation and you use a mediator, it's protected by a statute here in Texas. Every jurisdiction's law is different. But if people can generally agree that it'll be confidential, except as required to be reported by law. For example, you're going to have to, if you get evidence of child abuse, you will have to break mediation confidentiality to report that. But there are certain things that every professional has a duty to report. But
here's another one. It happens. What do you do if a board member attacks another board member on a personal level and says, "Oh, Jim Eskin, he drinks too much"?
You have to be to be effective at preventing that or shutting it down immediately. You have to have ground rules. And so if you suspect that you're going to have these kinds of pieces of misconduct happening, then you need to set ground rules at the outset. And whoever is the presiding officer or the respected official needs to say, welcome, everybody. We've had a lot of boisterous meetings. We now have set some ground rules. No interrupting, show respect, keep your agreement once we make it, all of the general ground rules that we set out, and enforce it. That's the best way. Just doing something at the time, you're an autocrat. If it's some ground rules that you've set at the beginning, then it would be better. Consider, for example, some of the wackiness you see in presidential debates on TV from everybody.
Yeah.
There's interruptions. They don't let the interviewer or the questioner finish. They go walking. They wander around. It's not limited to one party or one person. They don't set out ground rules and enforce them. If they'd set out ground rules, set them at the outset in 30 seconds and say, in order to proceed with this debate, you must agree to the ground rules. And they'll say yes. And then as soon as they violate the ground rules, you can shut their mic off because that's the rule.
By the way, Lincoln and Douglas, they had good ground rules.
They're two stumps. That's good.
Hey,
Jim, I was going to let you know that.
Did Mr. Munster have a question?
Joel,
question, John?
Yeah, Joel Batowski from Dallas, Texas, wants to know what 3 character traits do you look for in selecting a board member?
Okay. We were going to get in that. Barbara and I have a deal. If it's an easy question, I'll take it. If it's a challenging question, she'll take it. This one's yours.
Oh, this one's mine. Okay. Well, I'll start with a caveat, and that is we need diverse board members, my opinion. And so not every board member has all of the characteristics one would like. Good listener, it's not going to surprise you that good listening skills or willingness to develop good listening skills would be way high. Maybe number 1. I'd like to find a board member who also has a desire to learn, and that's related to listening skills. So, from a mediator standpoint, those are 1 and 2. Desire to learn.
By the way, that's distinctly different than a board member who thinks they know everything, right?
Well, you can even train people who think they know everything. I'm a fairly arrogant person. And I have to work on that. But, I think you could train people who think they know everything to create. This is kind of interesting. You can create the appearance of listening as a gesture of respect. And then what happens is, if you follow all the rules of active listening, like you use an open style, you lean forward, you put your hand on your face to exhibit that you're interested, all of the techniques that are used, you end up listening. And you end up listening because you need to figure out how you can best answer their position, or you may learn things. And so if you have intelligent people willing to learn active listening skills, then that would be, I gave you number 1 and 2, and really depends on what you're lacking on the board. Because the third one, I'd like to have a little openness about what I get to choose for the third skill.
Yeah. And the follow-up to that, Margie asked, respect for each other seems to be the most critical skill in listening. How do you teach people to listen?
Oh, that is great. Let me tell you some examples of how we teach. Well, it started out just teaching children, but adults like this too. One of the early exercises, and it's mentioned at the end of the book, you put 2 people together, and then they're surrounded by the audience who's listening, and his job it is to kind of watch what's happening. And then you give each person in advance some sort of secret or concept that they're supposed to be conveying to the other people. And then you time it, and you say, you 2 talk to each other for like 1 minute, and you both just argue with each other. And so you get 2 people in their faces arguing with each other. And the rule is you have to put in what the other person's supposed to learn during your argument. And they do. And the audience around there is having a great time watching these people just go at each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards, you separate everybody. You say, okay, what go around the audience. What was the secret? What was the secret for person A and what was the secret for person B? Usually nobody figured it out. And never can A and B figure it out when they're both talking to each other. Mm-hmm. And they're trained. They're supposed to be listening to figure out what that secret is from the other person. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen. And it's only a 5-minute exercise at most. And afterwards, they're amazed that it was said and they didn't hear it. Mm-hmm. They were too intent on arguing. And they so enjoyed arguing. It's a fun. People are laughing in the audience. They're just having a great time. But nobody learns what the information is. The other one is through examples of more serious examples where they do mock mediations, play acting. Children, again, are great at this. They come up with a scenario, and the important part of the scenario is, again, there's something that's sub rosa, something hidden that you don't really know, because what is appearing on the surface is just one kid is trying to beat up on another kid in the class, and it's always getting into trouble. There is a sub rosa problem, either jealousy or some deep-seated problem because somebody either stole something, stealing pencils, some sort of threat, some sort of insult. It dominates children's lives. What happens at school starts small, perhaps, but it ends up dominating these children's lives. And they can give you the scenarios that are really affecting them. Mm. And if you can catch those early and show how it happens, that's the way to train them. And by doing it in mediation practice, where they practice and ask the children or the adults, if you're dealing with adults, come up with a scenario. They will come up with a scenario. And then as they practice, they suddenly realize, because you're told, that's not the problem. Tell me what the underlying problem is. And then they start talking. And then it finally comes out. And instead of being two people arguing with each other and people circling around listening, it becomes a controlled environment where one person gets to tell their story. What happened and how did you feel? And then the next person gets to tell their story. What's your side of it? What happened and how do you feel? And then you ask open-ended questions. And this is the beginning stage. And then after they talk all about it, then the mediators, and they're in tandem when it's children, they'll move and they say, we are moving to the next stage. We have now talked about the problems. We've identified 4 problems. How do we solve it? And then they find out 3 of the problems aren't really problems. It was the 4th thing that came up that is. But because you have a scribe who writes these things down, they return to them and say, how do we solve that? And then you take down seriously the solutions. Sometimes the solution by a child is make him move. Tell his family just move. It is often the solution the children think of. And so you take it down, and then the children 5 minutes or 10 minutes later say, okay, we've got these 9 issues. Tell us how the first one will work. You want him to move. John, can you move? Well, no, my dad's got a job there and we have a house, so we can't move. Okay. What if we turned it around? Harry, can you move? Well, I can't move. My dad has a job. My mom has a job. I kind of like other things in the school. I'm not moving. And so you move past that. They haven't been forced to move past it. They've come up with the unfeasibility of the solution. And then they get to the next one. And you know what the solution is usually? The solution to these things usually is, I'm going to give you a formal apology if you will accept it. Or we both apologize to each other and we'll put it in writing, and we promise we won't do it again. We'll put it in writing. Literally, the majority of times, the children come up with a solution that involves an apology and not to do it again.
Very interesting.
No
money.
Hey,
what's your advice on board mentoring programs, and how can you avoid them turning into cliques? Board mentoring programs.
Broad question. Depends. How about that? Depends on the mentor. And my advice would be you have a process that's followed, especially for issues that may come up. Because on one-on-one relationships, if the people don't know each other very well, they need to have somebody they can talk to. And so a mediator or just a neutral person that they can speak to in confidence is really helpful. I got no problems with mentoring as long as it's applied fairly. It's the perception of unfairness that I've seen to be a problem. You tell me, whoever's asked the question, tell me what the biggest problem they have in mentoring.
Hey, Barbara,
Sure.
we've been focusing on individuals within the same organization problem, having disputes. What do you do if there are two nonprofits in the same mission space and they're fighting?
That's really an important question nowadays, particularly with with financial issues nowadays, and with the advantages sometimes of merging or finding alliances. What do you do with it? I think one of the things you can do is say, let's have a controlled conversation about this where we listen to each other. And that goes back to Megan's first question. How do you prepare? The preparation for that is what's key. Find out what the true interests are of these organizations. So the research beforehand is really essential. And you find out what the needs and interests are of these organizations are, as opposed to their positions, as opposed to the positions they take. And then when you do that, it's good to have dialogue. It's really good. In a
here's one I think it's come up a lot. What do you do with a major donor, someone who's, say, getting six-figure gifts to your organization, but they attach too many strings to their gift?
Well, that person needs to be listened to. And I mean, you've got to figure out who's had the longest or the best relationship with them, assuming this is a longstanding donor who's been well cultivated. If it's a new donor who comes not with money, but with mostly strings and wants to be the puppeteer.
This one's coming with money. Okay,
coming with money and wants to be the puppeteer without a long-term relationship and not long cultivated. So you're concerned that the strings are going to hamper the well-being of the organization long-term. Yeah. That one needs to be a sit down, and where you listen to that donor, researching beforehand what the donor's true position is. And I do think that the kind of what we call positions of respect, that's where listening to the donor, just listening without arguing with them, without trying to explain what the problem is. After doing your research, I would have somebody somewhat neutral. I know if you're with the organization, you won't sound neutral, but try to find somebody in the community who'd be neutral, knowing that it's not going to be confidential unless there's a strange area of confidentiality you can attach to it. But sitting down, have a listening session with the donor, really feel them out in terms of why it is they need all these strings. And then, and only then, if they're willing to listen in return, do you then say, here's how you would harm the organization if we were stuck with that string. Either we have a legal problem with it, we have in terms of our corporate, in terms of our unique, the way we're organized, we would have a serious either legal or structural problem with doing things that way. We'd be treating other people with disrespect who are in similar positions. So, but I would wait to argue with them or point out the problems. I would just schedule a listening session.
Okay. Boy, that word listen, there's a lot of power in listening. I think a lot of us think the power is in talking. You're reminding us the power is in listening. Now, what are your recommendations to develop a good relationship between the board chair and the CEO?
Well, it's not going to be any different than what I've said. I think that it obviously depends on the nature of the relationship in terms of how you structure a system. If it's new or old, though, the one thing that remains true is everybody wants to know what the other sides should know and should want to know what the other side's interests are and what their positions are as well. And so I'd say, again, this sounds repetitive. Schedule a listening session.
Right.
Have it moderated by somebody, because the person, when you're talking or listening, you can't write down the ideas. You just can't. And so have somebody there whose job it is. And if you want to make them minimized, call them the scribe. Hi, this is whoever, their job is being a scribe. But then you make sure the scribe understands their role, which is if there's something nasty or pejorative said, it gets written down a whole lot differently than it was when it was said.
Hey, let's move to the subject of time management. I think everyone will declare there are too many meetings and they run too long. What's your advice on effective time management for a nonprofit board meeting?
Enforced time limits. I love enforced time limits.
Such as the development report's going to take 10 minutes, finance is going to take 5, and you respect the time parameters that are shared, and you don't let some board member go on forever when they only are been allotted 5 minutes.
Well, and you make those agreed time limits.
Yeah.
In other words, at the outset, not while it's happening. It's the same as with a debate. When you have a debate and you say you only have this amount of time and you're only going to do this, and you can't insult each other, and you can't physically walk out of your space, and you can't go more than blank minutes, get them to agree to the time limits beforehand. And then you need somebody neutral to enforce the time limits. We're going
talking about limits, what are your recommendations on board limits, like 1 year, 2 years, 4 years? What are your suggestions on term limits for board members?
I'm gonna not weigh in on that because it's such a varied question. I have differing feelings about it. I mean, I'm not very objective on that issue.
Okay, let's move on. By the way, well, we have about 8 minutes now. Any questions from the audience? We'll take a question from the audience.
Not at this point.
Okay. Let's talk about committees. Every board has committees. How can committees be used to minimize skirmishes?
Oh, that is a great idea, because it's not like you're sending it to some purgatory. You're sending it to a committee. I think the key with use of committees is to take the trouble to train the people who are on the committee to do these activities, especially active listening. And it actually can be fun, and it's a team building kind of thing. It actually brings people together. And so, and it's easy, it's not hard to do. It's basic stuff. And it doesn't require a retreat. It doesn't require all day. And I suggest the way you use the committees is you develop the committees you want, but then you have the committees go through this basic training of active listening and using play acting with just problems that are made up. But the made up problems are usually going to be very realistic for what these people are having to go through, especially since these people are volunteers and they need to be honored for that. They may be warring with each other. They may have difficulties, but these people are volunteers, and at their base, at least if we're talking boards, and I'm really not talking about well-paid boards. That's not what I'm talking about.
No, we're talking about nonprofit boards.
Yeah, we're talking about people who are kind and good. They may have different personality issues, but that's what makes life sweet. And I think we need to embrace the differences, and instead of it turning to aggression, it really, I know I sound like a Pollyanna as I say it, but it really does work. I'm a trial lawyer. I spent decades, fighting in trials, and I enjoyed it, but this is better. This is better.
I can tell. Hey, is it very different to maintain control over an in-person than a virtual meeting? What are the differences of being in control of a virtual as opposed to an in-person meeting?
Well, it's interesting you use the word control, dear, but I'll take it as, I got unplugged. Hang on just a second. All right. My computer feels much better. Thank you.
Okay.
it depends on whether or not what kind of control you're talking about. If it means enforcing ground rules, if you're talking about enforcing the ground rules that have been previously agreed, then I strongly would tell you that while it's easier to do on Zoom if you are able to, use your mute ability, you can mute somebody, and that's frustrating. And so the ground rules in a Zoom meeting need to be, especially if you're worried about it, is I think we've all agreed from the last time, given the way it degenerated and how people were trying to throw things at each other but couldn't across the spots. We will mute you if you break the rules, and we've got an agreement to that, right?
Right.
And so when they say that, that's good. So it's easy on Zoom, but the key is to getting the agreement beforehand. The advantage of being in person is obvious, and that is you have the physical presence of everybody all in one saying, we're behind the chairman enforcing the ground rules. But the key, Jim, is you got to have the ground rules first. And if you set the ground rules, and the ground rules are so important and they're so basic. And I even keep them here because I do my mediations from here, and I for a while was teaching from here. But the ground rules are like it's like you're a kid. You say you agree to show respect, you agree to listen to each other, use your best efforts to resolve it, carry out the agreement you make, and then everything is confidential. Those are the basic ground rules. And the don't interrupt, you listen without interrupting. That's the one you want to enforce. That's the usual one that's the problem. And it's easier to do by Zoom. And people have learned.
What are your thoughts on coming up with a meeting agenda?
What are my thoughts on a meeting agenda?
Yeah.
Well, it won't surprise you that one of the first things after you welcome people and give gestures of respect is that you start setting out ground rules. I know it sounds like a broken record, but it's a huge difference because you can say,
can you talk?
Agree to the ground rules.
Will Robert's Rules of Order get you through a meeting, or you need ground rules on top of that?
Well, Robert's rules are grounded in due process, I think, from ancient times, I would say, but better to have ground rules on top of Robert's rules. Robert's rules clearly are process, and they're meant for both procedural fairness and substantive. There's substance there sometimes. So I'm not talking about parliamentary procedure. I'm talking about more basic, anybody, even without having read or studied Robert's rules, would know. Listen with respect. Don't interrupt. Robert's rules would take care of that, but that sure would be difficult.
Yeah. Hey, we only have 2 minutes left. Do we have time? Do we have any last questions from the audience?
Not at this moment, Jim.
Well, the book is called A Listening Space, A Barbershop Guide to Problem Solving. Barbara, it's on Amazon, right?
Yes, sir.
Is it? I got it in Kindle. It's available in Kindle. And again, it's if you're in a nonprofit and are new to the board, you're new to the CEO, this will be a wonderful resource for you. Barbara, this was your third webinar. So I hate to tell you, part of my ground rules is when you do such a good job, we invite you back. Thank you for sharing everything you know about problem solving and quality decision making. And I want to thank our learning community of volunteer and professional nonprofit leaders. The hour flew by. What we're going to do, we're going to post a little summary. I think we have it down to 1,300 character spaces. That's brief. That's the limit in LinkedIn. And we're going to post that on LinkedIn and Facebook. And then John Largent's going to do a little magical spin dry with the tape. And we will post that on social media. Oh, probably, John, about 10:30 tomorrow morning. Okay.
Sounds good.
So, Barbara, once again, I think I owe you a parking space. This is your third webinar, and this one accomplished exactly what we wanted to do. Again, thank you for being such a leader. in the art of problem solving and quality working relationships. Thank you, and continued good health, and good luck with those 5 grandchildren.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see the audience on August 17th. We'll come back, and Diana Hoyt's going to lead a webinar on developing your case for support. Very, very essential in the nonprofit world. So Barbara, thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
And John, another good session. And to our learning community audience, thank you again for the work you do, which every day touches, improves, and saves more lives. You are heroes to us. So thank you. You all deserve a golf ball that was hit on the moon if we had our way. Thank you, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Good night. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you.